Hello and welcome to episode 422 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really enjoying Andy's new, I should say renewed experience of lawn bowls. Is that what you call it, Andy?
It is, yeah.
So you've got to explain to people who don't know that you used to play bowls at quite a decent level, didn't you?
Yeah, so I started playing bowls when I was about 10 years old. It's something my family have always done, my dad and grandparents, and I just kind of got into it. But because I've played it for so long, I managed to get to a certain level, and I've played at sort of county.
Yeah,
national.
get to the chase. What did you win when you were younger, in your younger days?
In my younger days, I was national champion.
Yeah, so anyway, Andy...
with a part of a team. I wasn't individual.
Let's not be modest. So Andy plays bowls and he's now joined his local village team. He's out in the middle of Kent. And I wish we could talk about it on the podcast every now and then, because the stories Andy comes into the office and tells us about the politics, and I don't think we'd really understand what goes on in a bowls club in terms of, obviously most of the people are retired, but the politics, the bickering, the infighting. I think they could make a mini series about the lawn bowls fraternity, but I think it's fascinating. So anyway, I'm enjoying hearing about lawn bowls and what's going on there. Maybe every now and then we might give you a few insights into what is the latest scandal at the Lawn Bowls Club.
I would just like to say, for balance, that there are also lots of positive stories that I bring to you about people all coming together from all parts of the community. And so there is a bit of that as well.
Yeah, but I prefer the stories where people are chucking coke at each other. Anyway, moving on from that, Andy, you've got a couple of reviews. We did ask people to send in reviews. Please make sure that you do send in reviews for the podcast, because it obviously is incredibly motivating for me and the team, but also helps us with our positions in those charts on the podcast apps you use. So Andy, you've got 3 I think you're going to go through quickly today. Each of these are going to get a Money to the Masses mug. So if your review is read out, then do email in damien@moneytothemasses.com and claim your Money to the Masses mug.
That's right. So the first one is from Indoor Kite 307. It was titled Great Advice. I really enjoy this podcast as they cover investments and money issues in very simple terms. Before I started to listen, I didn't understand that much when it comes to investing my money. But since listening, I've started to make my money work better for me. Thanks, team. And the next one is from Vicky, and it says, I'm new to Money to the Masses, but thoroughly enjoy listening to every episode. The information shared is topical, interesting, and delivered in a very comprehensive way. Excellent work, Damien and team. And the final one is from my favorite username. It's Jacka Potato, and it says, thank you for sharing the knowledge at the start of my understanding my finances journey. So thank you very much for sharing all you do. I love the budget spreadsheet, and I've shared it far and wide to encourage others to take responsibility for their finances. Keep up the fabulous work.
So they are fantastic reviews. If you're wondering what the spreadsheet is, we don't talk enough about the resources that we provide. We did create a spreadsheet. Well, it exists on the Money to the Masses site. We will put a link in the show notes, and it's a spreadsheet that helps you to budget. So you can build a budget that you can stick to. There's links within that spreadsheet to articles that can help you cut your bills. But more importantly, it helps you manage your money, because it looks at things that are your necessities, your needs, the things that you have to purchase. Basically, it uses the 50-30-20 principle. If you want, you can apply it using that spreadsheet. Anyway, there'll be links in the notes, and I hope you will find it incredibly useful, as Jacket Potato has. And before we move on, just quickly, we did have a comment on our YouTube channel, because we do put parts of the podcast out as segments that people can watch if they want to, so it attracts a different audience. But if you like seeing us, as Susie Logan 3524 did, when she said, great to see you both together, cheers. That's quite nice. So you can go and look at me and Andy recording this podcast.
Okay, so let's move on to what we're talking about in this week's podcast. 3 pieces as usual. What have we got coming up?
So I'm going to do an investment piece. It's an update on a summer portfolio. So something I talked about in the past about changing a portfolio to take advantage of seasonal trends. And there are seasonal trends that I've identified with 80/20 Investor that you can take advantage of. And then what I'm doing is I'm looking at how did it play out in 2022, because it was an unusual year. And did it work? Did it not? What can we learn? I'm then going to do a piece on savings rates. So there's been a lot happening in the news regarding savings rates. The FCA meeting with the banks trying to force them to increase savings rate. I'm going to talk about what that is, but also an interesting product that's now coming out, an interesting savings account that tracks the base rate. So that is the second piece. And then we're going to move on to the final piece, Andy, where you're going to look at scams.
Yeah, I'm going to be looking at scams. Action Fraud have come up with some research on the type of people who are being targeted and the types of scams that are quite prevalent at the moment. So I'm just going to cover a few of those to make sure people are aware of them, and to make sure that they don't get caught out. Okay, so let's move on to the first piece of the podcast then. We're going to be talking about summer portfolios.
Yeah, so this is a piece of research that I carried out a few years ago for 80/20 investor members. As ever, you can see the full research if you want to take out the free trial, but I'd like to give some insights onto the podcast. Now, this research was built off the back, or I should say inspired by the sell in May phenomenon. So for those of you who don't know, there's an adage that goes, sell in May, go away, don't come back till St. Leger's Day. And the idea is that you would sell out the market in May, and then you would buy back into the market. So we're talking about equity markets here at St. Leger's Day, so when the horse races run. And so that's in early September. The day actually changes from year to year. And the idea behind that is there's a lull in equity markets that people noticed over years. And it really took its roots in the days when perhaps the city would empty out, people would go to polo matches, and they would spend their summer doing as they wish away from the trading desks. And then the number of trades would fall during the summer months, which would increase volatility in equity markets. And there was a phenomenon where you would see increased likelihood of equity markets tumbling in the summer months and then picking up again. And when you looked at the numbers over the years, that did seem to be a phenomenon that actually existed. So the phenomenon has changed somewhat. If you look at the recent years, in fact, I think the last time it actually worked, so you go and sit in cash over the summer months and then buy back into equity markets in the September, that worked. I think the last time was about 2019. So in recent years, if you've done that, you'd actually missed out on some decent rallies. Now, 2022 was a year where it did work. So we've gone through this period where the sell in May phenomenon has weakened. It doesn't seem to be as prevalent. There was a hint that it does tend to work a little bit better in equity markets in Europe over the last 15 years. But in the last year, 2022 was unusual because, as we know, we saw equity markets tumble, we saw bond markets tumble. So what I did in past podcasts, if you go back to podcast 323 and then 377, 323 was the podcast where I introduced this idea of a summer portfolio. 377 is where I looked at it this time last year to see how it performed in 2021 and any lessons that we could learn from that and any insights. Rather than just looking at the idea of going into cash, so going from equity markets and being invested in them during the first part of the year, when May comes along, you jump into cash and then go back in during September for the rest of the year until the following May. Rather than do that, I created this idea of a defensive summer portfolio. So you moved into alternative assets instead of cash. And there was actually this phenomenon where certain assets did seem to do better during summer months than they did in the winter months, if you looked at the last 15 years. And so I crunched the numbers, and the asset that was the one of choice for the optimum summer portfolio was actually UK gilts. When we did this last year, I talked about the performance of those portfolios over the longer term. And if you've just been in a buy and hold strategy since 1992, you'd got an annualized return of 7.21%. If you just stayed in equity markets, that's UK equities. If you'd sold in May and gone into cash, it would have been 7.2%, not much different. But if you'd gone defensive, you bought gilts during those summer months, then you would have got 9.1% per annum. Well, last year, what happened? Well, it was a disaster. So not all these things can work all of the time. But last year was an unusual year. It was really a once in a, not even a decade, it was more than even a once in a generation type of event for bond markets. So for bond markets, there were people saying it was the 1 in 100 year event where bond markets just collapsed. Yields spiked. If you look at the worst performing assets in 2022, it was actually UK gilts. Well, I say that it was index linked gilts because they have a longer duration. So when interest rates were rallying, they were rising. Bank of England, for example, was raising the base rate. The US Federal Reserve was raising its interest rates. It really hurt any bonds that are out there. And the ones that had the longest duration, so things like gilts and index-linked gilt funds, they got hammered. So I'm going to give you some numbers so you can get an idea of how it performed. If we look at a chart of the performance of, say, the sell in May and go away portfolio, go into cash, last year, that actually performed at 0.32% over that summer month. So you made money. okay, rates were starting to pick up, but you didn't lose money because you sat in cash. If you'd used the defensive version, so the summer portfolio that I'd created that had worked very well historically, during last year, you'd have lost 10%. So that just shows you that these things can't work all of the time. But that was the year that I said was the once in a generation or worse type event. Now, of course, you don't know that isn't going to happen again the following year. So what I did is looked at alternatives to that defensive portfolio, so alternative assets rather than use UK gilts. And in the past, I looked at the odds of an asset class being negative during the summer months and calculated what are the odds. And that's why we got to UK gilts. The odds in the last 15 years of the summer months being negative for that type of asset was only about 13%. So it was incredibly likely you'd have a positive summer when it came to UK gilts. So does that mean that the whole research is thrown out the window? Well, no, because when I did the research, I looked at the likelihood that an asset type would provide a positive return over the summer months based on recent history. That's the last 15 years. There were other assets that were close seconds and thirds to UK gilts. And some of those included things like global bonds, for example. So how did global bonds do in 2022 if you'd had a portfolio over the summer months that didn't go into gilts but went into global bonds? Well, rather than being down 10%, you'd have been down just 1.9% if you'd used global bonds. If you'd used UK corporate bonds, so sterling corporate bonds, that wasn't as good. That had been down around about 7%. So you can see there were other asset classes you could have used. And like I said, obviously cash worked very well. Now, there was another phenomenon I talked about last year about assets, how they tend to perform versus each other during different periods of time. And I mentioned on last year's podcast, if you go back and listen to it, that interestingly, North American equities tended to outperform UK equities during those summer months. And yet again, it happened in 2022. North American equities, as an average, I'm looking at unit trust sector averages when I quote any of these numbers. So individual funds could do better or worse, but I'm looking at the averages. The average was up 0.67% during the summer months. Yet if you looked at the average UK all companies fund, that was down about 6.5% over the summer months. So that phenomenon still exists or existed in 2022 anyway. So if you want to see the full research where I look at all the assets, which ones have actually improved their performance over history, the chances of outperforming over that summer period, then you can look at the full research piece. I look at all of the asset classes, including equity markets. You can see what's going on. But the point is that there is a seasonality that exists, but sometimes when you get these macro events, even some kind of seasonality that might exist in markets can be completely knocked for six. So you might be thinking, well, what does this mean for 2023? We've already started the summer. The analysis looks at the 1st of May onwards. How are we doing? Well, the old defensive portfolio that went into gilts is currently down around about 4%, which is the same as if you'd stayed invested in the markets, actually, in UK equities. Obviously, cash at the moment is doing well because cash rates have gone up. And so you will be looking at some pretty interesting cash rates. Obviously, this year, you're getting much better cash returns anyway. So I'm not talking about cash ISAs and savings account. Of course, you can get much better rates. We're going to talk about savings rates in a minute. But if you're looking at just the investment platform, so you are investing, what rate of cash do you get just on money that's parked there? Well, Andy's just updated the research that he's carried out previously on this. And for stocks and shares, ISAs and SIPs, I mean, you can quite easily get 3% with some platforms on money that's temporarily sitting there that isn't invested. I'm not telling people to try and time the market. It's just the reality that the rates you get on cash at the moment are better than they were previously. So this year, yields are increasing on bonds. And so that means particularly UK gilt. So at the moment, it doesn't look like that summer portfolio is doing particularly well, but there are still a few months left of this summer to see if things can be turned around.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece then. We're going to be talking about savings rates. There's new products coming out. There's been pressure from the FCA on the banks. What have we got for this piece?
So it's been an interesting news week. We've had the FCA meeting with banks to put pressure on them to pass on the rate rises that have been going on. So to give you an idea, we've seen the Bank of England raise the base rates now at 5% as we make this podcast, but we're seeing mortgage rates go up, but savings rates aren't going up at the same rate. So it means that banks aren't passing on the rate rises to savers, and they are passing them on, and in some cases more so, to mortgage borrowers. So that means on that differential that they pay out to savers and what they get from people they loan money to, that's their margin and they're making more profit. So there has been pressure put on the banks to reduce that margin, and that will hopefully mean better rates for savers, but also improved ones for mortgage borrowers. So you've got to think about, at the moment, there's been calls for the government to step in and help mortgage borrowers because rates are rising. Now, I covered this on last week, why that's obviously unlikely to happen. Because of monetary policy, when the Bank of England is moving interest rates, it is trying to encourage people to save money because there will be more attractive savings rates. So it takes money out of the economy. People save it to earn a return, which means they buy less stuff, which means therefore inflation hopefully will start to calm down and we actually see the inflation rate fall. That's the theory I covered last week as why that won't necessarily work in practice at the moment, certainly not as efficiently as it would have done in the past. With mortgage rates, we've obviously seen them rising and we've got a lot of people still on fixed rate deals, so the pain isn't filtering through to as many people as it used to because they're still on their fixed rate deals, have yet to come off them. Now, one thing would help is if banks passed on the higher interest rates, then that would obviously encourage people to put money in savings accounts and it would draw money out of the system, so out of the economy. And of course, in some ways, if we see that margin squeezed, so it means banks are offering more competitive mortgage rates as well, that might ease a bit of pressure on people who are borrowing and who's seeing their mortgage rates go up. Now, you've got to see it from another perspective as well. What's happening if a mortgage lender offers a very attractive mortgage rate, they get flooded with applicants. And it's a similar thing that happens when you get banks offer the best savings rates. So as soon as you get the best rates, they then pull them. And so you can get this scenario, particularly with mortgages, where banks will say that they can't sustain or maintain good customer service levels if they get flooded with applicants. So they end up trying to almost dissuade applications by offering uncompetitive rates. And you can get this vicious circle where the rates keep going up, even though, well, they're not necessarily reflective of what's going on with the base rate, for example. So the FCA are trying to make banks play ball a bit more, stopping them profiteering because they're being accused of that. So one message for people listening to the podcast, make sure you shop around, because if you stay with your existing bank, you're not guaranteed to get the best rates. If you go to podcast 396, we talked about how you can get 7% on your savings with products from the likes of First Direct, who offer regular savings accounts that pay a very high interest rate, but there are limits on how much you can put in a month. If you go to episode 277, we talked about cash ladders, not as effective in a world where rates are going up, because if you think rates are going to keep rising, then it isn't as attractive using a cash ladder. And of course, there's cash savings platforms. These are the platforms that exist where you can move money between savings accounts more easily rather than having to go to each banking institution each time you want to put money away and open accounts. There's one platform online that allows you to move money between different banks as your cash matures, let's say from a fixed rate bond. And we talked about that on episode 291. So for people who are fed up of banks not passing on the Bank of England base rates and not increasing their interest rates, there is a new account that's come out that tracks the base rate. So when the Bank of England increases the base rate, within 3 days, the United Trust Bank's new account will increase their rate in line with it. So this new account is a 180-day notice base rate tracker account, and it currently pays 5% interest, and that's gross. So that is the current base rate. So if the base rate goes up, this will follow that. But if it gets cut, it will also follow it on the way down. So there is a catch, of course, there always is. You have to have £5,000 to use this account, and there is a 180-day notice period. So if you want to take money out, you have to give 180 days notice to get your money out of that account. Now, how does that stack up with what's available out there? I mean, it's obviously attractive because you're guaranteed to get base rate rises passed on to you under the terms and conditions. But if you lock your money away, you can actually get better than that at the moment. Now, there is a notice account that's only 90-day notice that's from BLME, so that's the Bank of London and the Middle East, that offers 5.09%, and that is a minimum of £10,000 you need to have that account. And there is an account from DF Capital that offers 5.05%, and it's again a 90-day notice account with a smaller minimum amount of £1,000 you need to open it. We'll put a link in the notes because these things change regularly, so you can see the latest rates. So for comparison, you can get accounts with a shorter notice period that offers just a bit more interest, but they're not linked to the base rate. So you have to bear that in mind. But if you're willing to lock your money away for longer, so fixed rate bonds, you get a 1-year fixed rate bond with an interest rate of 6.1% from first save. You need £1,000 to open that account. 2-year, you can get a 6.15% interest rate, and again, a minimum of £1,000. We'll put a link in the notes of this podcast so you can see the latest interest rates on all of these accounts, because they do change regularly. And of course, you can have easy access accounts that offer a 4.35%. Again, we'll put links in the show notes. It's not as much as the tracker account, but that is still very good for an easy access account. And that is among the highest rates we've seen since the financial crisis. So in summary, make sure you shop around. There are now new innovative products that are coming out. You can get products that do track the base rate if you are unhappy with the fact your bank isn't passing on those rate rises. And from experience, do keep an eye out for innovative products. We'll bring them to you. We'll talk about it on the podcast and have them on the Money to the Masses website. But in the past, there were very innovative products, like products that give you an average of the top 5 accounts, things like that were available. I think we might start seeing more innovative savings products going forward, but we will bring them to you.
Okay, so let's finish off the podcast with our final piece, and we're going to be talking about fraud and scams. Action Fraud have released some research that suggests that middle-aged people, and I had a little sweat, Damien, when it started to talk about middle-aged people. Does that include me? Sadly, it does now. So people in their 40s and 50s, and it's said that they're less likely to be scammed. But the reason they've come out with this research is while they're less likely to be scammed, they are actually the age group that needs to be most cautious due to the fact that they generally have a higher disposable income. And so the scams that are most prevalent at the moment, in fact, they've increased 4-fold in the last year, are WhatsApp scams. So one of the most convincing ones that we've seen, and Damien and I, we've both had personal experience of people we know who's nearly fallen foul of this, is the hi mum and dad scam.
So I just want to bring this to your attention because I meant to mention it a couple of weeks ago, but I was standing beside a football match watching my daughter play, and someone I know came up to me and we chatted and said, I can't believe I've just got off the phone to my mum and dad. I've just had the strangest call. And they then relayed that their mum and dad, who they were on holiday abroad, rang them and said, hi, are you okay? I got your message earlier and is everything all right? It transpired that his mum and dad had received one of these hi mum and dad messages, which then says that they're in trouble and they can't talk, but can you transfer some money to them to help them in a situation? And obviously it varies what the message says, but that's pretty much what they all have in common. His parents started to ring around family and friends to raise £3,000 and were just about to send the money over. They tried to call his wife, but his wife's phone wasn't on. They assumed, therefore, there was something generally going on, but then they eventually got hold of their son. That was who I know. And they said, yeah, everything's fine. I don't need your money. And then he got to the bottom of it. They got this text message and they were that close to transferring their money. And it just shows how prevalent this kind of scam is and how easily people do fall foul of it, because circumstances like in that one where somebody didn't answer their phone, they may be somewhere where they weren't getting the signal, they just assumed the worst. So please don't think that you won't fall foul. Even though we're talking about people in their 40s and 50s, you've got to think about your own parents as well who could be falling foul of this, thinking that you are contacting them.
And so other types of messages you might receive through WhatsApp are messages that are trying to impersonate messages through your bank, perhaps HMRC or even police, because all of these organisations, these trusted organisations, are embracing technology now. And you are finding that they are available on things like WhatsApp. So just be super careful. Make sure that you're dealing with the right person. If in doubt, look up the number for that particular organisation and go through your usual means. If it's coming through WhatsApp and it looks a bit suspect to you, it probably is a scam.
And there are instances where fraudsters have spoofed numbers, so it appears that a message falls in your usual text messages that you think are coming from your bank in the past. Always be suspicious of everything. So you can go and get your own card and look at the number on the back of that card, because that will be genuine, and ring them and double check any messages or communication that you are getting. It's definitely worth doing because it could save you a lot of pain.
And so I'll just rattle through these last few ones. Investment scams, particularly those that involve in cryptocurrency. Again, due diligence. Make sure that you check everything. Go through your usual means of communication. If it comes or pops up on WhatsApp or via a random email, just be super, super careful. Romance scams are on the rise again, where people are obviously using various apps to contact people and meet up with people. Suddenly it moves to WhatsApp. If it doesn't feel right, just be super careful. Invoice fraud is the last one I wanted to touch on. And they are targeting people mainly through emails, and they're looking for things like big bills, say for home renovations or vehicle purchases. And then they try and target that individual. And actually, in some cases, they're very, very clever because they will actually use the language that you've used in previous messages. And they'll actually use numbers that you've discussed in previous quotations to make it look authentic. So you should be super careful on that. If there's a sudden change of payment details, for example, always make sure you question it.
And always transfer a small amount and make sure it gets to where it needs to go. So you can transfer like £1, but like Andy says, question it. And the other thing to remember that the people that you are communicating with could have had their emails hacked. And therefore, they are sending you information that seems genuine because the details are correct about maybe it could be a villa deposit or something like that. And you are getting correct information from them, but it's not coming from the person you think it is because they're unaware that their systems have been compromised.
Okay, so that's it. We're done for this week. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com or Andy at moneytothemasses.com. Don't forget, we're on Facebook. We have our Facebook community, which has grown in numbers week by week. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses if you want to get involved.
And excitingly, we've joined the world of Threads. So we've started an account. If you follow us on Instagram, it's incredibly easy to find our account on Threads and follow us. We are going to be exploring that new social media platform. If you don't know, then Mark Zuckerberg has created a Twitter competitor. So basically, think what Twitter is. He's made his own version that's meant to be more friendly and happier. We'll see how that works out. So yes, that is it for this week, Andy. As the music plays out, can I just ask you one quick question about bowls? Have you ever seen a fight on a lawn bowls green? Is it a green? What do you call it?
It is a green. It's very good. I have to say, I haven't seen a full physical fight. I have seen what you would call a confrontation and lots and lots of F-bombs.
F-bombs? Has anybody ever thrown a bowl? I suppose you'd knock someone out if you did that.
Until next time.
Until next time.